There's a specific process a narcissist uses to break an empath, and it isn't chaotic or random the way it might look from the outside. It's methodical, even if he's never consciously mapped it out this way. A sequence that moves through distinct stages, each one dismantling something specific, each one setting up the next. Understanding this process in detail is one of the most protective things you can do, whether you're currently living through it, trying to make sense of something that already happened, or simply trying to recognize the early stages before they have time to fully take hold. Let's start with the foundational insight this entire process depends on, because everything else builds from it. A narcissist doesn't break an empath by attacking her all at once. He breaks her by slowly, incrementally converting her greatest strengths into liabilities, using her own good qualities as the exact mechanism of harm. This is worth understanding clearly because it explains why so many empaths struggle, even years later, to fully articulate what happened to them. It didn't look like an attack while it was happening. It looked at almost every stage like something closer to love. Stage 1. Identifying and mirroring her specific capacity for depth. This begins before the relationship even fully forms in the earliest conversations, where a narcissist skilled at this process demonstrates an unusual, almost startling ability to match her emotional depth. Most people, encountering someone with genuine emotional intelligence and sensitivity, respond with some warmth, but rarely with complete, immediate mirroring. A narcissist targeting an empath does something different. He reflects her depth back almost perfectly, seeming to understand her at a level she's rarely experienced before, asking questions that feel unusually perceptive, responding to her feelings with what appears to be rare, exceptional attunement. This mirroring isn't actually connection in the way it feels. It's information gathering disguised as intimacy. Every response he offers, every seemingly perceptive question, is quietly building a detailed map of exactly what she values, exactly what she's been missing in previous relationships, exactly what kind of validation lands most powerfully for her specific history and specific wounds. This stage typically produces an intensity of early connection that feels, to her, like finally being truly seen. And this feeling, genuine and powerful as it is on her side, is precisely the foundation everything that follows will be built on top of. Stage 2, establishing her as the primary source of understanding and stability in the relationship. Once the initial mirroring has produced genuine emotional investment, the dynamic begins shifting gradually and almost imperceptibly toward a specific role assignment. She becomes, without ever consciously agreeing to it, the one who understands him more deeply than anyone else ever has, the one capable of seeing past his flaws to the wounded person underneath, the one whose patience and insight make her uniquely qualified to be what he needs. This role feels, from her side, like being trusted with something precious, the real him, rarely shown to anyone else. What's actually happening, though, is the quiet establishment of an unequal structure disguised as intimacy. She's being positioned as the emotionally stronger, more insightful, more capable partner, flattering on the surface but functioning to slowly transfer the relationship's entire emotional labor onto her, framed not as an imbalance, but as a testament to her exceptional capacity. This stage often includes early stories about how badly he's been hurt before, how few people have ever really understood him, how different she is from everyone who came before her, all of it building the specific narrative that positions her ongoing understanding and patience as not just wanted, but necessary for his well-being. Stage 3, introducing inconsistency once the emotional investment is deep enough to survive it. This is where the process shifts from building connection toward actively destabilizing her, and it's worth understanding why this specific timing matters. Introducing inconsistency too early would risk her leaving before enough investment exists to withstand it. Once genuine emotional investment is established, though, inconsistency becomes remarkably effective because now she has something significant to lose by walking away and something significant to try to preserve by staying and working harder to understand what's changed. This inconsistency typically starts small, a warmth that occasionally unpredictably cools, a promise that sometimes doesn't get kept, a mood shift that arrives without clear explanation. Her natural response, given everything we've discussed throughout this series about how deeply she extends genuine compassion and charitable interpretation, is to search for what she might have done to cause the shift, or to extend patience while assuming there's a reasonable explanation she simply doesn't have access to yet. This searching, this patient extension of charitable interpretation is exactly what this stage is designed to produce. Stage 4. Converting her empathy into a mechanism of self-blame. This is where the process becomes genuinely corrosive because it takes the very quality that makes her exceptional, her deep capacity for self-reflection and honest accountability, and redirects it entirely toward herself, disproportionately, regardless of where responsibility actually lies. Once inconsistency has been established as a recurring pattern, a narcissist skilled at this process begins subtly, then increasingly directly, framing conflicts and disappointments as reflections of her own failures rather than his choices. This might sound like, "I wouldn't have reacted that way if you hadn't pushed me," or "I only get like this when I feel like you don't understand me," statements that convert his behavior into her responsibility, using language specific enough to sound like genuine feedback rather than obvious manipulation. Here's what makes this stage so effective against exactly this type of person. An empath's genuine capacity for self-examination, which in healthy relationships serves her well, becomes a vulnerability once it's aimed disproportionately at absorbing blame that isn't actually hers. She's genuinely capable of asking, "What did I do wrong here?" and genuinely willing to consider the answer honestly, qualities that would be strengths in almost any other context, but that become exploitable once someone consistently, deliberately frames every conflict as requiring exactly this kind of self-examination from her, while requiring almost none from him. Stage 5. Isolating her gradually from the people who would notice the pattern. This stage rarely looks like obvious control, because obvious control would trigger exactly the kind of recognition this entire process is designed to avoid. Instead, it typically unfolds through small, individually reasonable-sounding comments. A friend who's described as not really that supportive of you, a family member who doesn't seem to understand your relationship, a hobby or commitment that starts feeling selfish because it takes time away from him during a period when he really needs her attention. Each of these, in isolation, sounds almost caring, almost protective. Accumulated over months, they produce a shrinking circle of people who might otherwise notice and name the pattern she's living inside. This isolation matters enormously to the overall process, because an empath surrounded by people who know her well typically has access to outside perspective that could interrupt the self-blame we described in stage 4. Removing or weakening those connections removes exactly this check, leaving her increasingly dependent on his framing of events as the primary lens through which she understands what's actually happening between them. Stage 6. Exhausting her capacity to trust her own perception. By this point, the foundation has been laid for what's often the most damaging stage of the entire process, the systematic erosion of her confidence in her own memory and judgment. This typically begins with small instances of reality being subtly rewritten. "That's not what I said. You're remembering that wrong. I never agreed to that." Delivered with enough confidence that questioning them starts to feel unreasonable rather than justified. because she's already been positioned throughout the earlier stages as the emotionally insightful one whose perceptiveness makes her uniquely capable of understanding him. This direct contradiction of her memory creates a genuinely disorienting conflict. The same perceptiveness she's been told makes her exceptional is now, apparently, unreliable, exactly when it matters most. This stage is worth understanding as the culmination of everything that came before it. The mirroring established trust, the role assignment established investment, the inconsistency established confusion, the self-blame established a habit of looking inward rather than outward for explanations. The isolation removed outside perspective that might interrupt the pattern. And now, with all of that foundation in place, her trust in her own perception, the single thing that would allow her to see this entire process clearly, becomes the final target and often the most difficult one to fully dismantle, precisely because it's the thing standing most directly between her and genuine recognition of what's actually happening. Stage 7. Extracting the specific resource this entire process was actually built to access. Here's what's worth understanding about the actual purpose underneath all 6 preceding stages. They were never really about the relationship itself, or even about control for its own sake. They were about accessing, reliably and repeatedly, a very specific resource. Her capacity for endless understanding, endless patience, endless emotional labor, extracted at minimal cost, because every mechanism that would normally protect against this kind of extraction has been systematically dismantled across the preceding 6 stages. This is the actual function this entire process serves, whether or not the narcissist executing it has ever consciously mapped it out this explicitly in his own mind. Now let's talk about what actually breaks this process, because understanding all 7 stages is only useful if it changes how you recognize and interrupt them, whether you're seeing this pattern in your own life right now or trying to understand something that already happened to you. Here's the first thing worth understanding clearly. This process, as devastating as it is, depends entirely on one specific condition remaining true throughout every stage: that her sense of self-worth continues drawing primarily from his validation and understanding rather than from a source stable enough to survive his inconsistency without collapsing into self-doubt. This is the actual singular point of vulnerability every one of the 7 stages is built to exploit and reinforce. Which means the actual antidote to this entire process isn't fighting each individual stage as it arrives, exhausting as that would be. It's building and protecting exactly the kind of internal, self-generated worth we've discussed throughout this entire series. Worth that doesn't fluctuate based on his approval, doesn't require his validation to feel real, and doesn't collapse when his behavior becomes confusing or inconsistent. This matters enormously for how you interpret each individual stage if you recognize it happening in your own life. The mirroring in stage 1 becomes far less powerful when you're not desperately searching for someone to finally, fully understand you, not because you shouldn't want to be understood, but because your worth doesn't depend on receiving that understanding from any single specific person. The role assignment in stage 2 becomes far less binding when your own sense of stability doesn't require being someone's sole source of understanding in order to feel valuable. The inconsistency in stage 3 loses its power to confuse you when you're not automatically assuming responsibility for explaining someone else's unpredictable behavior. The self-blame mechanism in stage 4 loses its grip when your capacity for honest self-reflection remains genuinely balanced, applied to your own actual choices, rather than disproportionately absorbed, regardless of where responsibility actually lies. The isolation in stage 5 becomes far harder to execute when you maintain genuine, ongoing investment in relationships outside the primary one, refusing to let any single person become your entire source of connection and perspective. And the erosion of trust in your own perception in stage 6 loses its power when that trust was built on something more solid than his agreement, direct experience, consistent internal signals, a track record of your own perception, proving reliable across many situations that have nothing to do with him at all. Here's the second thing worth understanding, and it's perhaps the most important reframe as we close out this entire discussion. Recognizing this seven-stage process, whether in real time or in hindsight, doesn't mean you were foolish, weak, or somehow uniquely susceptible to something other people would have easily avoided. This process is specifically, deliberately designed, even when not consciously mapped out this explicitly, to work against exactly the qualities that make someone a genuinely good, deeply feeling person. Falling into it doesn't reflect poorly on your judgment. It reflects the genuine sophistication of a pattern built specifically to exploit compassion, patience, and the capacity for deep connection, qualities that are, in every other context, exactly what make you someone worth knowing. If you're currently recognizing yourself somewhere in these seven stages, whether early or well into the process, understand that recognition itself is genuinely significant. Every stage we've described depends on remaining largely invisible while it's happening, precisely because visibility is what allows you to interrupt it before it completes. You don't need to have already built perfect, unshakable self-worth in order to start interrupting this process right now. You simply need to start noticing in real time which specific stage is currently operating on you, and begin the deliberate, sometimes difficult work of reintroducing exactly what that stage depends on you not having. Outside perspective, if you're isolated, trust in your own memory, if it's being challenged, balanced self-reflection, if you're absorbing disproportionate blame, and above everything else, a sense of your own worth that doesn't require his validation in order to remain solid and real. This process was designed to break something in you. But here's what's worth understanding as the final, most important truth. What it actually breaks, when it succeeds, was never really you. It was the specific, temporary belief that his understanding was the source of your worth in the first place. That belief was never true, even during the years you might have organized your entire life around it. Your worth was always actually generated somewhere else entirely, somewhere his approval was never actually capable of reaching, and somewhere his withdrawal was never actually capable of touching, even during the years it might have felt otherwise. Rebuilding access to that source is the real work ahead of you, whether you're just beginning to recognize this pattern or well into recovering from it. It was always there. It's simply time to remember exactly where to find it again. Let's talk more specifically about what rebuilding this source actually requires, because understanding that it exists somewhere separate from his approval is only the first step. The harder, more practical question is how you actually locate it again after years of having it systematically redirected elsewhere. The first practical piece of this work involves something worth naming directly: relearning to trust small, low-stakes instances of your own perception before attempting to trust yourself on anything significant. This might sound almost too simple to matter, but it's worth understanding why it's actually foundational. If your trust in your own memory and judgment has been eroded over months or years through the specific mechanism we described in stage 6, attempting to immediately trust yourself fully on major, emotionally loaded questions. Was the relationship actually as harmful as I remember? Am I actually right to feel hurt by this? Often fails, precisely because those questions carry too much weight and too much old conditioning to serve as a stable starting point. Instead, this rebuilding tends to work better when it starts smaller, noticing when you predict accurately how a conversation with a friend will go, noticing when your read on a stranger's mood turns out to be correct, noticing when a decision you made based on your own judgment alone produces a good outcome. Each of these small, low-stakes confirmations rebuilds the underlying muscle of self-trust, gradually, in a way that eventually becomes strong enough to support trusting yourself on the larger, more significant questions too. The second practical piece involves deliberately, consciously rebuilding outside connection, even when isolation has made this feel genuinely difficult or unfamiliar. This is worth understanding honestly. If stage 5 of this process succeeded in narrowing your circle significantly, reaching back out to people you've lost touch with, or building entirely new connections, often feels awkward, sometimes even shameful, especially if time has passed and you're not sure how to explain the distance without revealing more about what happened than you're ready to share. This awkwardness is worth pushing through anyway, not because you owe anyone an explanation, but because outside perspective is genuinely one of the most protective resources available to you going forward, both for finishing the process of seeing clearly what happened and for recognizing much faster next time if anything resembling this pattern ever begins to take shape again with someone new. The third practical piece involves something we've discussed throughout this entire series, but that deserves specific emphasis here. Rebuilding a genuinely balanced relationship with self-reflection, rather than either abandoning it entirely out of understandable exhaustion or continuing to apply it disproportionately the way stage 4 trained you to. This means practicing deliberately the specific skill of asking, was this actually my responsibility, or am I defaulting to blaming myself out of old habit? Every time you notice guilt or self-criticism arising in a new situation, this isn't about becoming someone who never examines her own behavior. Genuine accountability remains valuable and important. It's about restoring proportion to that examination, ensuring it's applied honestly rather than reflexively absorbed regardless of where responsibility actually belongs. Here's something worth addressing directly, because it's a common and understandable fear during this rebuilding process. Does doing this work mean you'll become less empathetic, less capable of the deep connection that made you vulnerable to this process in the first place? This concern deserves a clear answer because it's genuinely important. The goal was never to become less capable of empathy, depth, or genuine connection. Those qualities were never the problem, and diminishing them wouldn't actually protect you. It would simply cost you access to some of the most valuable parts of who you are, without addressing the actual vulnerability that made this specific process possible. What actually needs rebuilding isn't your capacity for empathy, it's the structure around it, the boundaries, the balanced self-reflection, the outside perspective, the self-generated worth that should have been protecting that empathy all along, allowing it to remain fully intact while no longer being exploitable in the specific way this 7-stage process depends on. I want to address one more thing as we bring this discussion to its full conclusion, because it's worth understanding honestly. This rebuilding work takes real time, and it rarely happens in a straight line. You might find yourself months into genuine progress, suddenly doubting your own memory again during a moment of stress, or noticing old self-blame patterns resurface during an unrelated conflict with someone new. This isn't evidence that the work isn't real or that you're somehow back at the beginning. It's simply evidence that patterns built over years, especially patterns reinforced by someone deliberately exploiting them, take genuine time and repeated practice to fully unlearn, the same way any other deeply ingrained habit does. What matters most, more than perfect, uninterrupted progress, is the overall direction you're moving in. Whether, looking honestly at the pattern across months rather than days, you're trusting your own perception more consistently, maintaining more outside connection, applying self-reflection more proportionately, and locating more of your own worth internally rather than needing it confirmed externally. If that trajectory is genuinely present, even alongside occasional setbacks, you're doing exactly the work this entire process requires, regardless of how imperfect any single week or month along the way might feel. The 7-stage process we've described throughout this video was built specifically to exploit a version of you that believed her worth needed to be earned through someone else's understanding. Rebuilding the version of you that already knows better, the one who was there all along, underneath every stage of this process, waiting to be reconnected with rather than needing to be created from nothing, is genuinely difficult work. But it is entirely, completely possible, and it belongs to you, regardless of how long the process ahead of you actually takes.